Did the Civil Rights Movement inspire the Disability Rights Movement?
Yeah,
Chris Palamas,
first of
Boston,
all,
Massachusetts.
when we want to talk about or trace the origins of the disability rights movement, have to deal with the complexity of, probably that larger group of social phenomena you might call the disability movement, because there were antecedents. But what I would call the disability rights movement, the movement that was grounded in a civil rights perspective, that was grounded in the development of a sense of political consciousness among a community of people with disabilities that crossed specific diagnostic categories. The inspiration was drawn from the protest culture of the 60s, and I think there were a number of influences. First and primary was the civil rights movement. I think just as progressively oriented folks throughout the country were inspired by the civil rights movement, so too were people with disabilities. But there was also, of course, the modern women's movement in the latter part of the 60s, and both of them contributed hugely to the perspective of the civil rights movement. In very specific terms, that is, as I count it, the first event, the first stirring of the disability rights movement was the activism that sprung up in California with Ed Roberts as one of its leaders. I think one of the misunderstandings, Ed Roberts was not the only leader. He emerged as the most significant spokesperson, but there were a number of leaders, with Ed being amongst the foremost. But they drew their energy and inspiration from that culture of protest in California that really centered in Berkeley. And the roots of that really were in Mississippi Freedom Summer and the students who went into the South to do voter registration in Mississippi, and then came back to California. And from that sprung the free speech movement. Ed Roberts and the first of those severely disabled students living on the campus at Cal Berkeley were a part of and certainly close observers of the emergence of those movements.